On March 27th, 1964, at 5:36 in the evening, the ground beneath Alaska started shaking. That part isn't unusual. Alaska gets earthquakes all the time. Small ones, quick ones. The kind where your coffee mug slides an inch across the table and then everything goes still again. This was not one of those. This earthquake did not stop after a few seconds. It kept going. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a full minute. Then 2 minutes, then 3. And it kept getting worse. Not fading, not slowing down, building. The ground was not just shaking. It was rolling, like waves on the ocean, except this was solid earth. Frozen earth. Earth that people had built their homes on, their schools on, their entire city on. For 4.5 minutes, the people of southern Alaska had to stand there, or try to stand there, while the ground beneath their feet did something they never thought ground could do. It turned into liquid. Not water, not mud, something in between. The frozen soil and thick clay that held up buildings and roads and parking lots just stopped being solid. Scientists have a word for this. They call it liquefaction. But you don't need the science word to understand what it means. It means the ground quit its job. The thing that is supposed to hold everything up suddenly couldn't hold up anything at all. Streetlights in downtown Anchorage swayed so far sideways that they touched the pavement. One woman inside a department store watched the wall in front of her crack open. Entire neighborhoods broke apart and slid downhill like a slow-motion avalanche made of houses and dirt. A whole section of Anchorage's main street dropped more than 10 feet straight down, like someone had cut the road in half with a giant knife and lowered one side into the earth. And that was just the shaking. What came next was so much worse. Killer waves, fires that burned on top of the ocean. An entire town erased from the map, and a wall of water that traveled thousands of miles to kill people in California who had no idea Alaska had just been torn apart. When scientists finally measured this earthquake, it came in at magnitude of 9.2. That made it the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America. It was the second most powerful earthquake ever measured anywhere on the planet. Only one earthquake in all of recorded history was bigger, and that one hit Chile 4 years earlier. To put the power of a 9.2 earthquake in terms that make sense, think about it like this. The earthquake that destroyed much of Haiti in 2010 and killed over 200,000 people was a magnitude 7.0. The Alaska earthquake released roughly 1,000 times more energy than that. Not 10 times more. Not 100 times more. 1,000 times more. From a single crack in the earth. And somehow, despite all of that raw power, only 131 people died. That number sounds almost impossible when you look at the destruction. But there's a reason for it. And there's also a heartbreaking catch. Because most of those 131 people didn't die from the earthquake itself. They died from what it sent racing across the ocean afterward. But before we get to the waves that killed from thousands of miles away, you need to understand what happened on the ground in Alaska. Because some of the stories from that evening sound like they came from a disaster movie. Except every single one of them is real. If you're the kind of person who loves learning about the wildest moments in history, the ones that sound too extreme to be true, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss videos like this. We go deep into the stories that textbooks skip over, and trust me, this one only gets crazier from here. Section 2. When the ocean caught fire. Now, Anchorage was the biggest city hit by the earthquake. About 100,000 people lived there in 1964. It was a young city, still growing fast. A lot of military families had moved there after World War II because of the nearby Air Force base. The oil business was just getting started. Families were building houses in brand new neighborhoods. Life was good. It was a Friday evening, the start of a holiday weekend, and most people were home with their families getting ready for dinner. Nobody was ready for what happened next. To understand why the damage was so extreme, you need to know one thing about Anchorage in 1964. The city was young, really young. Most of the growth had happened after World War II, when the military built up Elmendorf Air Force Base nearby and thousands of families moved north. Buildings went up fast. Neighborhoods spread out across the hills. Nobody was thinking too hard about what the ground underneath those neighborhoods was actually made of, and that was about to matter more than anything. In a neighborhood called Turnagain Heights, families had built nice homes on a bluff overlooking the water. It was a beautiful spot. But the ground beneath those homes was made of a type of clay that looks solid and feels solid right up until it doesn't. When the shaking started and kept going, that clay lost all of its strength. The bluff didn't just crack, it broke apart into giant chunks and slid toward the sea, carrying 75 homes with it. Some of those houses were crushed flat. Others ended up tilted sideways at crazy angles, sitting on top of piles of dirt that used to be a hillside. The whole area looked like a giant had picked up the neighborhood, shaken it like a snow globe, and set it back down in pieces. The damage was so bad that the city eventually turned part of that neighborhood into a park. It's called Earthquake Park. You can still visit it today and walk through the area where all those homes used to stand. Over on Government Hill, an elementary school sat on another bluff made of the same tricky clay. When the shaking got bad, the ground underneath the school gave way. The building split apart and slid downhill in broken sections. Some pieces dropped more than 30 feet from where they started. The school was destroyed. But here's the thing that still gives people chills when they hear it. That earthquake hit on Good Friday, a holiday. School was out. The building was empty. If that earthquake had happened on a regular school day, with children sitting in those classrooms, the death toll in Anchorage alone would have been horrifying. Instead, nobody was inside, the luckiest timing in the history of American disasters. Downtown, the main shopping street called 4th Avenue cracked open. One side of the street stayed where it was. The other side dropped more than 10 feet. Old photographs from the next day show cars parked at normal street level on one side and smashed storefronts sitting way down below on the other side. It looked like the earth had swallowed half the block. A big department store called J.C. Penney lost its entire front wall. The heavy concrete panels that made up the outside of the building fell straight down onto the sidewalk. One person was killed. Across the rest of Anchorage, 8 more people died. 9 total in the entire city. That number is shockingly low for a city that just got hit by one of the most powerful earthquakes in human history. A lot of that luck came down to timing. It was a holiday evening. Most office buildings and stores downtown were empty. The neighborhoods that got hit worst by landslides had enough space between the houses that people could get out. If this earthquake had hit at noon on a Tuesday, the story would have ended very differently. But Anchorage wasn't the only place that got destroyed that night. And in the smaller towns along the coast, the luck ran out fast. Down in Valdez, a small port town on Prince William Sound, people were having a normal Friday evening. Workers on the town dock were unloading a supply ship called the Chena. Families had come down to the waterfront to watch, which was a pretty common thing to do in a small town. Kids were running around. About 28 adults and children were standing on or near that dock. When the earthquake hit, the shaking set off an underwater landslide right beneath the harbor. The ground under the dock wasn't solid rock. It was loose material that had been piling up at the edge of the water for years. When everything started shaking, that loose ground just slid away into the deep water and it took the dock with it. The whole thing collapsed into the sea in seconds. Workers, families, children, all of them pulled under the water with the broken dock and cargo. 31 people died right there, drowned or crushed in the wreckage. It was the single deadliest moment of the entire earthquake. More people died on that one dock than in the entire city of Anchorage, and it wasn't over. After the dock collapsed, a wave caused by the underwater landslide came rushing back into the harbor and smashed into what was left of the waterfront. The supply ship Chena, which weighed thousands of tons, was tossed around the harbor like a bath toy. The waterfront was flattened. The destruction was so total and the ground underneath the town was so clearly unsafe that officials made a decision that almost never happens in America. They moved the entire town, not just a few buildings, the entire town, every home, every business, every road. They picked a spot 4 miles away on solid bedrock and started over from nothing. New streets, new water lines, new everything. It took years to complete. The old town site is still there, an empty piece of flat ground by the water where an American community used to stand. If you visit Valdez today, you're visiting the new Valdez, not the original. The original is gone. In the small port town of Whittier, tucked between steep mountains on the edge of Prince William Sound, the earthquake triggered both landslides and waves that destroyed the waterfront. The Alaska Railroad depot, fuel tanks, and port facilities were smashed. 13 people died in Whittier that night, many of them caught between the mountains and the water with nowhere to run. 200 miles south in Seward, the disaster played out in a way that sounds like it couldn't possibly be real. The waterfront area had big fuel storage tanks owned by an oil company. These tanks were sitting on soft, loose ground that was just waiting to fail. And when the earthquake hit, the tanks cracked open and spilled fuel everywhere. Then the fuel caught fire. Then an underwater landslide sent a wave surging through the harbor. And that wave picked up the burning fuel and pushed it across the surface of the water. The ocean was on fire. Burning fuel riding on top of a wave swept through the harbor, destroying the railroad, the warehouses, the small boat harbor, everything along the waterfront. The flames lit up the night sky across Resurrection Bay. People who were there that night said it looked like the sea itself was burning. It is one of the most terrifying images from any natural disaster in American history. And it actually happened. The waterfront district in Seward was basically deleted, and what the wave didn't smash, the fire burned. What the fire didn't burn, the second and third waves finished off. Multiple waves hit Seward over the course of the night, each one pushing destruction further inland. Like Valdez, much of Seward's damaged waterfront area was later rebuilt in a different location, away from the most unstable ground. Over in Kodiak, the biggest fishing town in the area, waves came in and wiped out the harbor. Docks were smashed. Fishing boats were sunk or thrown onto land. Canneries where workers processed fish were destroyed. For a town that lived and breathed fishing, losing the harbor was like losing everything. The fishing industry there took years to recover. But the worst story, the one that still haunts people who study this earthquake, came from a tiny village that most Americans have never heard of. Section 3, the waves that killed from thousands of miles away. The village of Chenega sat on a small island deep inside Prince William Sound. The Alutiiq people had lived there for thousands of years. The name Chenega means beneath the mountain, and the village was tucked into a crescent-shaped bay with a waterfall splashing down the rock face behind it. In 1964, about 68 to 76 people called it home, depending on which records you look at. It was a close community. Everyone knew everyone. Families hunted seal, deer, and bear. They fished the rich waters of the Sound. They lived in sturdy log houses built to handle the harsh Alaskan winters. There was a small school, a Russian Orthodox church, and a general store. Life was simple and quiet. The village had been there for centuries, passed down through generations, one of the oldest, continuously inhabited native communities in the entire region. When the earthquake hit, the shaking was so violent that some people couldn't stand up. But the shaking was only the beginning. Within minutes of the ground going still, something strange happened. The water in the bay started pulling back from the shore. It pulled back far, much farther than anyone had ever seen. The seafloor was suddenly visible, exposed in a way that looked wrong. Some of the village elders might have sensed what this meant, but for most people in 1964, this was a mystery, not a warning sign. It should have been a warning sign, because that retreating water was about to come back, and it was going to come back with unbelievable force. Roughly 4 minutes after the shaking stopped, a massive wave slammed into the village. Survey teams later estimated it was over 30 feet tall. Parents screamed at their older children to run up the mountain behind the village. Adults with babies and toddlers tried to carry them uphill. But the wave was too fast. It tore children out of their parents' arms. It smashed the log houses into splinters and scattered the pieces across the forest and the water. Almost every building in the village was destroyed. When it was over, 23 to 26 people from Chenega were dead. That was roughly 1 out of every 3 people in the entire village. 12 of the dead were children. The only building left standing was the schoolhouse, which had been built high up on the hill, about 100 feet above sea level. The survivors were eventually taken to the nearby communities of Tatitlek, Cordova, and Anchorage. They arrived with nothing but the clothes they were wearing, scared, exhausted, and grieving for the people they had just lost. They never went back to live in old Chenega. The village that had been home to their families for thousands of years was gone. If you go to the old site today, you can still see the pilings in the ground where houses once stood. The schoolhouse on the hill is the only building that survived. 20 years later, in 1984, the Chenega people built a new village on Evans Island in a spot with higher ground, designed so that no tsunami could reach them the way the last one did. But the wound never fully healed. The community calls it the day that cries forever. Every year they remember what was lost, not just the people, but the place. Centuries of history, culture, and connection to the land, all washed away in a few minutes. Now, here's where this story goes from tragic to almost unbelievable. Because the waves didn't stop at Alaska. When the earthquake ripped open nearly 600 miles of fault line along the ocean floor, it shoved a massive amount of seawater upward. That displaced water turned into tsunami waves that traveled across the Pacific Ocean at speeds over 400 miles per hour. That's nearly as fast as a commercial airplane. Within about 4 hours, waves reached the coast of Oregon. Shortly after that, they hit Northern California. And that's where one of the most heartbreaking parts of the story happened, over 2,000 miles from Alaska. In Crescent City, California, a small coastal town, waves started arriving in the hours after the earthquake. The first few surges were not that big. Some people who had left their homes and businesses came back thinking the danger had passed. They went back to check on their shops. They went back to clean up. They thought it was over. It was not over. A fourth wave arrived. And it was the biggest one. It was more than 20 feet tall. It crashed through the downtown business district with almost no warning. 11 people died in Crescent City that night. It remains the worst tsunami event in California's recorded history, and it happened because of an earthquake that struck in Alaska thousands of miles away. There was no real tsunami warning system in place in 1964. No network of sensors on the ocean floor, no automated alerts sent to coastal towns. People in Crescent City had no way of knowing that a giant wave was racing toward them across the open ocean. They found out when it arrived. The waves didn't stop at California either. Tide gauges in Hawaii picked up surges nearly 6 hours after the earthquake. Measurable waves reached all the way down the coasts of Washington, Oregon, and into British Columbia. The earthquake was so powerful that water sloshed back and forth in lakes, rivers, and even swimming pools as far away as Louisiana and Texas. Scientists call this sloshing effect a siege, and it sank fishing boats on the Gulf Coast thousands of miles from Alaska. Water levels in wells changed as far away as South Africa. Even Japan, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, recorded small waves from this earthquake many hours later. One crack in the earth beneath Alaska sent energy rippling across an entire ocean basin. The whole planet literally rang like a bell for weeks afterward, vibrating at frequencies too low for human ears to hear, but clearly visible on sensitive instruments around the world. The earthquake was registered by water level instruments in 47 out of 50 American states. Only Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Delaware didn't pick it up. Let that sink in. An earthquake in Alaska was detected in nearly every state in the country. The Space Needle in Seattle, over 1,200 miles from the epicenter, swayed back and forth from the seismic waves. In total, of the 131 people who died, 119 were killed by the waves. Not the shaking. The waves. The earthquake itself, as violent as it was survivable. It was the water that did the killing. And that fact changed everything about how America prepares for disasters. But it also led to something nobody expected. One of the biggest scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century, and it started with a single man, a pair of boots, and a whole lot of barnacles. Section 4. The man who proved the earth moves. After the earthquake, scientists needed to understand what had just happened. And not just for Alaska's sake. They needed to understand what kind of earthquake could be this powerful, or this widespread, this destructive. Nothing in their textbooks fully explained it. How could a single earthquake rip open 600 miles of fault line? How could it lift islands 38 feet into the air and sink towns below sea level at the same time? How could one event send deadly waves across an entire ocean? The United States Geological Survey sent a geologist named George Plafker to Alaska. Now, Plafker wasn't some desk scientist being dropped into the wilderness for the first time. He had already spent more than a decade doing summer field work in Alaska, starting in 1953. He knew the terrain. He knew how to get around in places that had no roads, no airports, no easy way in or out. When the earthquake hit, he was actually down in Seattle. He heard that the Space Needle had swayed from the seismic waves, and he immediately called his boss. His exact argument was basically, any earthquake big enough to shake the Space Needle from Alaska, we need to be up there right now before the bulldozers flatten all the evidence. He was right, and he had a hunch that what the earthquake had done to the land itself would tell the real story. Over the next several months, Plafker traveled up and down the coast of Prince William Sound by boat and small plane. He went to remote islands and empty shorelines that most people would never see, and everywhere he went, he measured the same thing. How much had the ground moved? Not side to side, up and down. His tools were simple but clever. He looked at barnacle lines on rocks. Barnacles live right at the waterline. If the ground gets shoved upward, suddenly those barnacles are sitting high and dry, way above the water, in a neat line that tells you exactly how far the ground moved. He looked at old tide gauge records and compared them to new ones. He studied beaches and shorelines that had clearly shifted position. Nature had left behind a detailed record of what happened. You just had to know how to read it. And what he discovered blew the scientific community wide open. Some parts of the coastline had been shoved upward by the earthquake. Near Montague Island, the ground had risen by as much as 38 feet. That was the biggest vertical lift from a single earthquake that anyone had ever measured. It was like the earth had taken a deep breath and pushed part of the seafloor up into the air. But other areas had dropped. Near the community of Portage, southeast of Anchorage, the ground sank by about 6 feet. That doesn't sound like much until you realize what it meant. 6 feet was enough to put the town below the reach of a high tide. Salt water from the inlet started flooding in twice a day, every day. It soaked into the ground and poisoned the roots of every tree in the area. Thousands of spruce trees died where they stood. Today, if you drive down the Seward Highway toward Girdwood, you can still see those dead trees. They're bleached white and stripped bare. No leaves, no bark, just pale, skeletal trunks standing in the marshland like bones sticking out of the ground. People call it the ghost forest. It's been standing there for over 60 years. A silent monument to the night the ground dropped and the salt water moved in. The town of Portage itself was abandoned. It's a ghost town now. You can still see the ruins of a few old buildings slowly sinking into the wetland. But back to Plafker and his discovery. The pattern he found was not random. On one side of the fault, the ground went up. On the other side, it went down. And that pattern matched something very specific. It matched what should happen if one giant piece of the Earth's outer shell was being forced underneath another one. Now, in the early 1960s, there was a big argument going on in science. Some scientists believed that the surface of the Earth was broken into huge plates, and that these plates were slowly moving around, crashing into each other, pulling apart, and sliding past each other. This idea was called plate tectonics. Other scientists thought this was nonsense. The debate had been going on for decades, ever since a German scientist named Alfred Wegener first suggested that the continents used to be connected and had slowly drifted apart. By 1964, there was growing evidence for plate tectonics. Researchers studying the bottom of the ocean had found patterns in the rock that suggested the seafloor was spreading apart in certain places, but there was still a lot of pushback. Many respected geologists did not buy it. Plafker's work on the Alaska earthquake changed that. His careful measurements showed that the Pacific plate was being forced underneath the North American plate along the coast of Alaska. Think of it like this. Put your two hands flat on a table, one slightly on top of the other. Now push them together. They'll stick for a while because of friction. But eventually one hand slips, and the top hand springs upward while the bottom hand drops. That's basically what happened along the coast of Alaska, except the hands were enormous slabs of the Earth's crust, and the slip released 500 years of built-up pressure in a single violent moment. The earthquake had to happen because those two plates had been stuck together for hundreds of years, building up stress like a spring being compressed, and then suddenly they slipped. The plate on top bounced upward. The plate on the bottom dove deeper. That's why the land rose on one side and sank on the other. It was exactly what the theory of plate tectonics predicted should happen. It was one thing for scientists to sit at a desk and say that plates should move this way in theory. It was something completely different to walk along a coast and see the proof with your own eyes. The ground itself had moved exactly the way the theory said it would. Plafker used barnacle lines on rocks, tide records, and shifted shorelines as his measuring tools. Nature had run the experiment for him. All he had to do was read the results. Plafker published his findings in the journal Science in 1965. Within just a few years, plate tectonics went from a debated idea to the foundation of modern Earth science. The Alaska earthquake is now widely recognized as one of the key events that made that happen. It didn't prove plate tectonics all by itself. Other scientists were finding supporting evidence in other parts of the world at the same time. But the Alaska earthquake was, in many ways, the moment the theory stopped being an argument and started being accepted as fact. George Plafker went on to study the 1960 Chile earthquake using the same methods and found the same pattern. He spent his career showing the world how the Earth's surface works. He was honored with some of geology's highest awards, including the Penrose Medal. He passed away in April of 2026 at the age of 97, just a few months ago. The scientific framework he helped build is now the basis of everything we know about earthquakes, volcanoes, and the movement of continents. And the Alaska earthquake didn't just change science, it changed the rules. Section 5. What it changed, and could it happen again? The failures of 1964 left a long list of lessons, and America actually learned from them. Start with the buildings. In Anchorage, a lot of the structures that fell apart were built on ground that should never have been built on. The soft clay beneath Turnagain Heights and Government Hill had no business holding up houses and schools. Engineers knew after the earthquake that any future construction in areas with similar soil needed stricter rules. The research that came out of studying the damage in Anchorage fed directly into new building codes. Not just for Alaska, but for earthquake-prone areas across the entire country, especially California. Those updated codes are still used today. Then there were the waves. The fact that 119 out of 131 victims were killed by tsunamis, not by the earthquake itself, told a very clear story. People died because nobody warned them. There was no system in place to detect a tsunami and alert coastal communities. In Crescent City, California, people walked back into a danger zone because nobody told them a bigger wave was coming. After 1964, Congress took action. By 1967, the Alaska Tsunami Warning Center was up and running in Palmer, Alaska. That center, along with a partner facility covering the wider Pacific, eventually became part of a national warning network run by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Today, that network uses sensors on the ocean floor, tide gauges along the coast, and satellite data to detect tsunamis and send out warnings within minutes of a major earthquake. The entire system exists because of what went wrong on Good Friday 1964. The rebuilding of Anchorage itself became a test case for something new. For the first time in American history, a city's rebuilding plan was shaped by hazard maps instead of just property lines and money. Engineers mapped out which parts of the city were sitting on dangerous ground and told officials that some of that land should never be built on again. The most damaged part of Turnagain Heights was set aside. Other areas could be rebuilt, but only after extra work was done to make the ground safer. It was not a popular decision. People wanted to rebuild fast. Business owners wanted to reopen. But the engineers pushed back, and the compromise that came out of that argument set a model that other cities later followed. The human cost went far beyond the people who died. Thousands of Alaskans lost their homes. Many were taken in by family or housed in temporary shelters through a cold Alaskan spring. Remember, this is Alaska. In late March, nighttime temperatures can easily drop below freezing. Losing your house in Alaska in March is not the same as losing your house in Florida in July. It can kill you. In Kodiak and the fishing villages along Prince William Sound, families whose boats and processing facilities had been destroyed lost not just their property, but their ability to earn a living. An entire fishing season was gone. In many cases, more than one. And fishing wasn't just a job for these communities, it was everything. It was how they fed their families, how they paid their bills, how they defined themselves. Losing the harbor was like having the ground pulled out from under you in a completely different way. Insurance for earthquake and tsunami damage was rare in 1964, and even when it existed, it often didn't cover enough. Families rebuilt with savings, community help, and federal disaster programs that were still being figured out at the time. The government's response to the 1964 earthquake became a kind of practice run for the bigger, more organized disaster relief programs that would come later. There was also a quieter kind of damage that's harder to measure. The surveying teams that were responsible for keeping accurate maps of Alaska had to redo years of work. Elevation markers that had been set into the ground as fixed reference points were suddenly wrong. Some spots were feet higher than the map said, others were feet lower. Roads had to be rebuilt and in some cases rerouted completely because the ground they sat on had permanently changed height. Drainage patterns shifted. The reach of ocean tides changed. The earthquake had rewritten the geography of an area larger than many countries, and the paperwork took years to catch up. The landscape itself never recovered in some places. The ghost forest near Portage still stands. Earthquake Park in Anchorage still shows the scars. The old town site of Valdez is still empty, a flat piece of land by the water where a community used to be. In Chiniga, the old village was never rebuilt. The pilings where houses once stood are still visible, poking out of the ground like grave markers. So could it happen again? The short answer is yes, and scientists think about this a lot. Modern GPS stations and other instruments scattered across southern Alaska are tracking the exact same fault system that broke in 1964. And what they're finding is that parts of that fault are doing exactly what they were doing before the big one hit. They're locked, they're stuck together, and they're slowly building up pressure. Some sections of the fault that sit right next to the area that broke in 1964 have not had a major earthquake in a very long time. Scientists are still debating whether those sections might quietly release their built-up stress in slow, gentle movements that nobody feels, or whether they're loading up for a big future earthquake. Nobody knows for sure. And that's the scary part. With all the technology we have today, all the sensors and satellites and computer models, we still cannot predict exactly when the next big one will hit. What scientists have been able to figure out, though, is that 1964 was not a one-time event. By digging into the layers of mud and sand along the coast, researchers have found buried evidence of ancient tsunamis going back more than 1,000 years. The sand layers left behind by those old waves are stacked between layers of normal soil, showing a pattern. Big earthquakes along this fault seem to happen over and over again, separated by hundreds of years of quiet. And the ghost forest near Girdwood has something truly eerie to add to this story. If you dig beneath the visible dead trees, deeper into the mud, you'll find another layer of dead tree stumps buried below the surface. And below that, another layer. Each set of stumps marks a different ancient earthquake that dropped to the land and killed the trees in exactly the same way. The ground has been doing this over and over for thousands of years. The trees we see standing today are just the most recent victims. There are also specific parts of the fault that worry scientists the most. Sections further west along the Aleutian chain, near the Chemagan Islands, have not produced a major earthquake in recorded history. That could mean they're releasing stress quietly, in slow movements that nobody feels. Or it could mean they're locked tight and building toward something big. We don't know which one it is, and that uncertainty is what keeps earthquake scientists up at night. That means 1964 was not a freak accident. It was just the latest chapter in a cycle that has been repeating for as long as the Earth has existed. The next chapter will come. We just don't know when. It could be 50 years from now, it could be 300, it could be tomorrow. The Earth doesn't run on our schedule. Until then, the ghost forest stands. The warning centers watch. And the people of Alaska live on ground that once, in 4.5 minutes, reminded the entire world that solid Earth is not as solid as we think. Outro. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you learned something new, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Here's a question for the comments. If you were living in Anchorage in 1964 and felt the ground start shaking, what do you think you would have done? Stay inside? Run outside? Try to get in a car? There was no playbook back then. Drop your answer below. And if you want more stories about nature's most extreme moments, check out the video on screen right now. I'll see you in the next one.